Today, we're going to look at the Gospel of Luke. And there are several things we need to know about the four Gospels that we'll get into in just a few minutes. But let's talk about the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is different in that it looks like it was written with an intended audience of the Greeks or the Hellenistic Jews. So the people that were, even if they were not actually Greek, but lived lives among and as Greeks. And so when you look at the book of Luke, it kind of reads like it was written with the Greek and Hellenistic peoples in mind. So that was kind of the audience. We'll talk more about the book of Acts when we get to it, but it is believed that the book of Luke and Acts was not originally written as two separate books or volumes, but it was a continuous writing by the same person. Now, while we attribute the Gospel of Luke according to the man named Luke, who is believed to be a physician friend of Paul, he may have been Greek or he may have been a Hellenistic Jew, one of those. We're not really sure which of those is true. Tradition tells us that Luke was actually Greek and was a friend of Paul's. Now, the book of Luke was probably written around the year 70 AD, 70 AD, which would have been about 40 years after Jesus. So some time had passed in between there. Now, Luke was not an eyewitness, and actually Paul was not an eyewitness either. So when we're looking at Luke getting a lot of his information from Paul, we also need to know and understand that Paul was not an eyewitness. So we believe Paul got his information mostly from Peter as well. So the Gospel of Luke is heavily dependent upon the words from Paul, and Paul was a secondary source. So Luke then would be a tertiary source. So if we're looking that far out. Now, we need to know, well, if the Gospel of Luke is believed to have been written around the year 70, we also need to realize that the Apostle Paul died around the year 65. So the Gospel of Luke came out 5 years after Paul's death. Now, it is believed that Luke lived to a good old age. It is believed that Luke died somewhere between 84 and 100. So Luke would have lived alongside the Apostle John. The Apostle John is the only disciple that lived up until older age, and Luke also was. So Luke and John could have been the only two left. If you're just kind of imagining what was going on at that time. Were they actually contemporary or friends or hung out? Probably not. So while we attribute the book of Luke, the Luke and Acts, to have been written by Luke, it may not have been actually fully authored by Luke. Luke could have been involved, but it's more likely that there was a group of people that were close to Paul, and this would be like Paul's community. And so it's believed that the Gospel of Luke came out of Paul's community, whether it was a group effort or someone in that group who was highly educated in Greek, because the Gospel of Luke was written in a very high level, sophisticated Greek, not a common conversational Greek like all of the Old Testament had been translated into. I want us to just look very briefly at the four Gospels together: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Um, while we have traditionally thought of these as being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that may not actually be exactly true. When we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and in the earliest manuscripts that are found, they appear to be written in a very high level of Greek, which would not be an easy task for people that basically spoke Aramaic. And that would have been their primary language at that time. And their writing skills may not have been up to the task. And in their later years, the likelihood that they would have learned Greek to the point of being able to write in Greek and to be able to write in a very educated level of Greek is also probably not accurate. It is probably true that whoever the real, authentic author of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, came from a community like a community around Matthew, a community around Peter, a community around Paul, and a community around John. So these Gospels more than likely are from these four communities of the disciples: Matthew, Peter, Paul, and John. Now, it is currently believed that the books of Luke and Mark were written first, and then the book that we have as the Gospel of Matthew was written uh, later. It is also believed that Luke and Acts were written together as one and were later split, and that the book of John would come up after that. Any quotations that were made from these books that we know as the four Gospels, they were referenced as the memoirs of the apostles. They did not get the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John attached to them until sometime between 120 AD and 185 AD. 185 AD is the first time where we see the book of Matthew is actually being referenced as Matthew writing this, Matthew saying this. And that came from a gentleman who wasn't all that well received, but that's where it first began. Now, when we look at the Gospels and how they were written, there is a document that has sayings of Jesus. It's just a writing of the sayings of Jesus that, when you look at research on the authorship of this part of the Bible, this document is labeled Q because there's just really uh, no other good name for it. But these sayings of Jesus, written by someone we're calling Q, more than likely is the oldest of all of these writings: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and this collection of writings called Q. And this collection of writings Q is probably authentically recordings and written by Matthew. Now, it's believed that the book of Mark is written by someone within Peter's circle of influence or Peter's community, which might be this man Mark, or John Mark, he's sometimes referenced as. And if he wrote these would have been things that he heard within the community of Peter's followers, or more closely aligned with Peter, and the things in there, by tradition, it's Mark wrote these things that he heard Peter talk about, and then Peter had to approve them before uh, they began to be circulated. So this gospel of Jesus probably came from the community around Peter, and maybe this man Mark wrote it, or maybe not. The level of language from the earliest things, documents, lead us to believe that, yeah, probably wasn't. The Gospel of Mark was probably written just from whoever it was, maybe Mark, or the people that were in the community with Mark and Peter, the things that Peter said, and they wrote down the things that they remember Peter saying. Now, whoever wrote Matthew and whoever wrote Luke, they would have had access to Mark's writings of the things that, and I'm still saying Mark as if Mark is the author, because traditionally that's the way we have thought it, and that's traditionally the way we're going to think it, no matter what. But the writings that we now say someone named Mark wrote them, those are the things that Peter shared. Whoever wrote Matthew, it had been someone from Matthew's community, and whoever wrote Luke would be someone in Paul's community. And these people didn't have just what they heard from Paul and from Matthew. And remember, what Paul heard, he probably heard from Peter as well. But whoever wrote Matthew and Luke also had access to this oldest document of sayings of Jesus that historians have called document Q, which probably are authentically writings of Matthew. And then the book of John is different than the other three. Remember, the Apostle John lived longer than the others. He was the last to die of the 12. So he would have been around long enough to see these other documents finally actually get written and put out there. It's almost like the Gospel of John is, well, I don't need to say the things that are already being circulated in these other documents that were not called Matthew, Mark, and Luke yet. They were still in this group of circulating documents called the Gospel of Jesus. I think the Gospel of Mark, the real title is probably what we call, it's that very first verse that was the title, but then when they retitled it the Gospel of Mark, then they moved what was the title down into the verse, and it's like the first stories of Jesus, or the beginnings of Jesus, however that very beginning of the book of Mark comes. And so John then saw in, if it's John, or John talking about what was missing, and whoever was in John's community then actually wrote it, um, talked about, well, they didn't give the whole story here. Let me give more details. Or they left out this. And so it's almost like the Gospel of John is what they left out, and things like that. One of the theories is that along about the second century, the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter began to be circulating, and there were some like, yeah, there's some funny things going on with those. We're not sure those are authentic, but it's like, okay, everybody knew the name Peter and Thomas, but these other four gospels did not have a name. And so one of the theories is they put names on them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to give them credibility to kind of contradict the problems they were having with the Gospel of Thomas and Peter. Okay, so while we've looked at the Gospel of Luke and who may or may not have written it, you've just gotten some more background information about that. I do want to focus on a few things from the Gospel of Luke. Now, granted, sometimes you will find some parallel stories or identical stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but as we study them, we might focus on some of these more in one of the Gospels than we would in the others. There's a very good book that's written called Luke, and it's written by Adam Hamilton. Adam Hamilton is a pastor of a United Methodist Church in the Kansas City area. I've had the pleasure of listening to him preach. Actually, I heard him preach on the Lord's Prayer, and he's also written a book on that as well, which I have, which is excellent. And I would highly recommend that. The Gospel of Luke is more inclusive of women than the other writings that you find in much of the New Testament, and therefore the entire Bible. Luke is a few steps ahead when you're looking at women in ministry. I do recommend the book by Adam Hamilton called Luke. I also was pleased to have an opportunity to hear uh, Reverend Hamilton, Adam Hamilton, speak here in Houston during the period of time when uh, portions of the United Methodist Church were choosing to leave because uh, they did not want to uh, accept and recognize LGBTQ people within their faith-based communities. And uh, Reverend Hamilton gave it a very wonderful. Um, uh, I don't want. It was a sermon, but it also was a conversation, and he also hosted a panel of experts here at Chapelwood United Methodist Church here, and I was very pleased to be able to attend that, and I was very pleased by the way it went, and I was very pleased to hear from people from different perspectives and in their way that they would allow God to be God. So anyway, so I do recommend the book by Adam Hamilton called Luke. I do recommend multiple of his books. However, when I am looking at the the book of Luke, uh, I'm not going to speak about everything in there, but I do want to point of narrow in on four things. One, the lineage of Jesus. I also wanted to talk about distances. And for the most part, I really want to address the real temptation of Jesus. And I'm going to read an essay that I wrote on the real temptation of Jesus. And then I want to end our talk on Luke by looking at mercy. Okay. So when we're looking at the lineage of Jesus, and when you look, um, you will see what looks like a listing of the lineage of Jesus. Jesus was the son of Mary, was the son of, and there's a long listing of men. Now, when you look at the third chapter of Luke, you will see that it talks about Jesus was the son of Haley, and then it goes through the genealogy going all the way back to David, Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, and carrying out all the way through. Now, if you look at the genealogy of Jesus in other passages, you'll see where it says, wait a second, these are not exactly alike. Well, here's the reason for that. In other places, we find where the genealogy of Jesus is given as his genealogy through Joseph. Now, in our accepted faith principles, we accept Mary as the earthly mother of Jesus, but we don't acknowledge or accept Joseph as the earthly father of Jesus. So, using today's terminology, we would say Joseph was his stepfather. So, in that case, the genealogy of Joseph would not be relevant. Now, in their culture, it was. in their culture, everything passed through the male line of the family. The women really were not important. But I find it very interesting that in the Gospel of Luke, we see the genealogy of Jesus that actually is Mary's genealogy. So when it says Jesus was the son of Heli, Heli, and then it goes through that line. Heli was the father of Mary, and then it actually goes through there. So if you look at that genealogy of Jesus and where it says Jesus was the son of Heli, if they would have said Mary was the daughter of Heli, then the rest of it is exactly Mary's genealogy. And so I think that that's important for us when we're looking at the line of Jesus, so that Jesus was a fulfillment of the prophecy, was of the house of David. That is true through Mary's line. It's also true through Joseph's line, but if Joseph was the stepfather, then there was no actual connection through that line. A lot of in the story of Luke, we hear where there they were traveling here, they were traveling there. Uh, they took Mary and Joseph took Jesus to Jerusalem. Remember the story where he got lost, and we're talking about all of these travels they did. And I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs here that I wrote on page 372 of my book, Deep and Wide here. There were no planes, trains, or automobiles in those days. Traveling to other places was a significant event. The distance from Nazareth to Bethlehem was 90 miles. The distance from Bethlehem to Jerusalem was 6 miles. When you think of Bethlehem and Jerusalem, you think about this long distance. It was 6 miles. The distance from Nazareth to Jerusalem was 65 miles. When I walk for exercise, I walk at a rate of 4 miles per hour. It would take me 1.5 hours to walk from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. It would take me a little over 16 hours to walk from Jerusalem to Nazareth. Depending on where they started walking, the chore of presenting Jesus at the temple would have to have been something they were dedicated to do. So when they took Jesus to Jerusalem, that there was a dedication and a plan to do that, as it was for most of the people at that time. It's kind of interesting. And one of my other books, Canaan, the Land of Israel and Palestine, we're talking about this land that is mostly considered Israel today, and we really don't have a good idea as to the size of that. I will post a little overlay map that comes from that book, and I'll cite the page as well, where I have overlain the nation of Israel today on top of the state of Texas in the United States. And we'll see really what a tiny little puny place Israel is even today. The next thing I want us to look at is the temptation of Jesus and the story that we find in Luke. And I wrote an essay on that, and I'm going to share all of that with you. You might find it kind of amusing. Okay, this comes from page 375 and 374, and this devotional or essay was written following a look at Luke chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. And these are my words here. As we read about this story of the temptation of Jesus, I have vivid memories of a children's Bible with a lot of pictures that my brother and I had when we were in first and second grade. The picture of the devil was one of a blue and green furry man-like creature with a long tail and big lumpy behind, and he wasn't wearing any clothes. My brother and I would look at the picture and laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh. The artist had not enhanced the study for these two silly boys, but created a memory that will last forever. It is funny that as a child, I was not focused on the actual story, but on the picture that I was tickled by with laughter. It is interesting that today, as a grandfather of 5, I still am focused beyond the details of the actual temptation. I see the temptation of Jesus outside the actual story. I wonder about what took Jesus to the desert for 40 days. Why did he remove himself from others and need to be alone? I think the temptation of Jesus was other than the interactions with the devil that are depicted here. Jesus was about to begin the mission for which he was sent to earth in human form. As fully God and fully man, he knew what was to occur in the next few years of his life. His entire ministry was in a short period of a few years. As he knew it was time to begin sharing the messages he was sent to deliver, his humanness was also part of who he was. He must have felt some anxiousness about all that was to come. He may have even fretted over a way out. I can imagine him thinking about what would happen if he did not fulfill his mission. If Jesus was fully human and fully God, why would we not expect him to have considered not doing what he was supposed to? He had probably already witnessed his brothers and sisters getting married and having children. At 30 years old, he was beyond the age that he would have been expected to have married. Surely he had thoughts of, what if? I think that Jesus was in the desert for 40 days because he was tempted to not do what he had come to do. He was contemplating a way out. If any of us were called to do what he was called to do and knew the outcomes, we too would consider a way out. If Jesus knew temptation as we do, and if Jesus knew and understood what it was like to be human with all the human feelings, then he must have had all human thoughts and temptations too. The silly examples with the dialogue from the devil seem ridiculous scenarios to me. I do not believe that was the temptation of Jesus. The temptation of Jesus was an actual internal conflict of doing what he was supposed to do against embracing the human life and just fitting in and among the other people. As a member of a family, he surely loved his family. He must have loved his mother, his stepfather, his brothers and sisters too. He must have held a few nieces or nephews. As a human, he would not have wanted to leave them. I believe the biggest temptation Jesus faced was a desire to be human and just be normal like everyone else. He overcame the temptation and fulfilled his mission. We too have to overcome our fear and anxiety and follow the call of God upon our lives. Whether my interpretation of Jesus in this story is accurate or not, I do not know. What I do know is that if Jesus was human, then he would have experienced the same human emotions that I do. He would have faced the same types of temptation that I do. I I remember even as an older child and a teenager reading about Jesus being tempted out in the desert by the devil. To me, made no sense. You know, I can't imagine Satan saying to Jesus, if you bow down and worship me, I'll give you all of this. Well, Jesus was God. It already belonged to him. So it never did make sense to me. But in my years now, I really think that the temptation that Jesus experienced was really about not completing his mission. He was fully God. He was fully human. And the desire to remain in his human realm had to be very strong. I mean, I live as a human. God gave me life. I enjoy my life most of the time. Being a human, while has its challenges sometimes has many blessings as well. Being given human life is joy, and it can be joy. The fourth thing that I want to draw out of uh, Luke has to do when Jesus was having uh, a conversation or an altercation with some of the experts in the law again, and they were trying to trick Jesus into saying some things that they could use against him. So they were experts and they were quoting from the law, but Jesus knew that law, even the laws that were misused. And so Jesus gave them the parable of the Good Samaritan, where the different people passed by and some didn't do anything and didn't help, and then um, the Samaritan stopped and he took care of this person and bandaged his wounds and took him to where he could be cared for. And so Jesus says, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? See, the religious leaders, they knew that God called us to love our neighbors. They knew that. They just did not do it. And the same in today's society and churches and political organizations that claim Christianity, they still know that God calls them to love their neighbors. They just don't want to do it. And they're not going to do it. So they just kind of ignore that. So Jesus, in his story of the Good Samaritan, said, okay, well, which one of these was the neighbor? Well, it wasn't the priest. It wasn't the high society person. It was the person who was the natural enemy of this person who took care of it. And the expert in the law replied to Jesus, well, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. So, loving our neighbors and being good humans as modeled by Jesus is all about showing mercy. Jesus says, go and do likewise. The Good Samaritan showed mercy. That's what Jesus says we are supposed to do. So, I hope you have enjoyed this little look at the Gospel of Luke. Whomever wrote it, really, who the exact authorage of the Gospels is not really that important to us today. We have words that we considered a good retelling of the ministry, the life and lessons of Jesus, and our job is to use those. Um, I think we downplay the humanity of Jesus, and when we're really uh, um, looking at Jesus as fully human, I think my thoughts on the temptations of Jesus are probably more likely how that really played out than that whole mess with the silly devil, or that goofy little cartoon that was in that children's Bible that my parents tried to read me and my brother when we were in first and second grade, and all we did was laugh at the picture because it was hilariously funny. I'm not sure who has it now. I think my brother has our children's Bible. There was an Old Testament and a New Testament version of that. I think my brother has it. I don't have that. But if my brother has that, I sure would like a scanned copy of that picture somewhere. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you on the next time. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe.